Okay, so we are here to discuss about this merge request here. So about the authentication refactoring we are going to do for the package manager's API. And so we have NMR for the NuGet package manager. And I guess it's going well. I still have a few points. Perhaps I can present the two main ones and then we can discuss about your questions, if that's
Sure.
okay with you.
Works.
Okay. So my first main point is about the merging all the authentication settings together. We are using a function which is inheritable namespace or namespace inheritable. I don't remember the function name. And if we declare multiple times authenticate with from blah, 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 multiple times in a parent, in a root namespace, and then we have a new authenticate statement in a deeply nested endpoint, the actual code will take both statements and merge together the authentication configuration. And I think that it would be safer to start without this feature because we might end up in things that could be really, really hard to understand. Imagine that you have a root namespace. So like on line 10, there is the authenticate from with statement for the whole file. And then on a deeply, deeply nested endpoint or namespace on, I don't know, line 1000, we are a new authenticate from to statement. And the actual authentication settings used for this endpoint will be the merger of the two. And that could be a bit confusing for new readers. I'm thinking into our security counterpart. So he's not an engineer, so he doesn't work with Ruby all the time, but he can read the code. But still, I can imagine him having some issues about why a request gets through, and in this endpoint where I just have one authentication setting and it gets accepted, and that is because both settings get merged together. And so, yeah, I can imagine a few situations where this could be really confusing. So to keep the confusion of the start, I would say, I would rather start with not merging both settings. And if we need to have a specific setting for one nested endpoint, well, the developers will need to be explicit and just release all the proper or valid authentication configurations. So we will have some duplication, but I think I would favor settings duplication over confusion and readability.
If that, if I'm following, so with the way that they can be combined, is there a way to remove a specific
No.
authentication type right now?
No, yeah, that's a great question. I thought about that and then I forgot. But right now it's merged together by adding them together. So if you have a configuration on the at the top level, you can't remove anything from there. And
So
yeah,
I'm good with I'm happy to change it to your suggestion to just declare it, each time you have to declare it fully. To explain a bit of my logic, when I was writing that, I was thinking along the lines of something like Apache's allow deny rules for, I don't know if you've messed with Apache web server, but anyways, some of the stuff I've used in the past has, I was thinking of kind of like a nested authentication scope type thing. And in those cases, normally there would be a way to deny, but I didn't have a reason to make that, so I didn't make it. But I agree that for the time being, it is more straightforward to do it that way, or to do it just, a single declaration. One thing, oh, right, one thing that occurs to me is that if there is ever a reason to want to force a sequence in what authentication methods are tried, like I can't think of a reason to, but in the future, if there's for some reason we need to try personal access token, then deploy token. But again, I can't think of any reason why that would be necessary. So probably not really worth consideration.
Mm. Yeah, my thought is to have a really simple first version and iterate on it. And then
Yep.
when we have all the package managers included, then we will have a better view of, okay, perhaps we need to have a way to merge all the settings together in different endpoints. Perhaps we will not need that. But since we don't know the future, I guess I would tend to favor some strict rules. So if we don't need this feature, we don't implement it yet. Perhaps in the future we will need it, but
Yeah.
we'll see. Okay. I try to play around locally with this inheritable namespace. I don't like the function name at all. It's confusing and it's not.
I had to look that one up.
Yeah, it's not super well documented, the grep API, but I don't see any other alternative. The other alternative would be route setting, but route setting is not inheritable. So we would need to declare a route setting for all the endpoints. And that can be a bit cumbersome. It's actually what we have when we need to put a job token or deploy token authentication. We need to declare it on each endpoint. So I would still keep it as the internal function used by the authenticate statement. Okay, my second point is, yeah, there has been some discussion about, do we override user from sources or do we just simply update the function so that when we see that we have this new namespace setting, we will just use it exclusively. And if this namespace setting is missing, we just fall back to the current implementation. The idea here is to remove the override of user from sources. In the past few weeks, we we saw a few adventures and journeys on those files, Pigward and Oath Finders, and one of the issue was about having an override on top of another override, and so yeah, that's a complete mess. So I've been wondering if we perhaps should start straight off the bat having just an updated version of find user from sources. And if this thing goes well and we update the public API to use it, then we can just remove the the fallback, so the current implementation, and just use the namespace setting.
I'm totally in favor of that because I've had a wonderful time trying to decode all of the different overrides, being completely new to all this. One potential issue I see is I think that find user from sources is already overridden once. I think there's an API guard. I think it's defined an API guard both in core and in EE. I don't remember exactly what the EE version does if I'm right, but it might call the original, but that would make life more interesting.
Yeah. Well, from a quick search on the code source,
Or maybe there's only one now.
I only see one. The only thing that has been added a few days ago is the memorize, so that we don't look up the user several times. Perhaps what you saw is the access token, because the access token is defined in the auth finders and it has been overridden in the API guard helper methods.
I do believe there were 2 API guards, like last time I checked. So I think it must have been recently removed. Maybe that was part of moving package to core, or I don't know. But I do recall there being 2 of them at some point.
Also, the EE auth finders is now tiny. Looking at master on the web access, the only thing that's overridden is find OAuth access token.
Yeah.
So there used to be a lot more in there. So, okay, that's probably not relevant anymore then.
So, yeah, perhaps it's better to update the find user from sources function so that we don't deal with overrides anymore.
I'm good with that.
Well, we'll see once we have the MR in maintainer review. Perhaps the maintainer will not be happy about, I don't know, putting more mess into the API guard file, but we can still try. I think it's worth it. It's better to have this than another override.
And if the maintainer shoots that down, it's not hard to change it back.
Yeah, and the final goal is really to remove the fallback and just keep the find from the namespace setting or find the user from Warden, and that's it. Okay. I think we have a third point with the question from Steve that was asked 1 hour ago. The thing is that perhaps we have been fooling ourselves thinking into, okay, this is where the tokens could be, and we are going to try all the token types that we are declaring. So mix both from and with together. But
And
yeah,
just so to clarify why I had asked this question, sorry to interrupt. My thought here is not necessarily along the lines of package, because in package we generally do want, check all of these tokens coming into this header. But if we eventually want to apply this to the wider API and get rid of auth finders and API guard completely, we don't want to check a personal access token from a deploy token header. So that's kind of where this question comes from.
So
yeah,
on that, I think the current so the current syntax will make it easier to say from these three sources, get these three kinds of tokens, because you can put an array for both, whereas with the hash, you're going to have to replicate that array. And so I think, to me as a developer, it would make sense to have both the authenticate with from function and an authenticate with token function in the future. So so essentially I'm saying I think it's valuable to keep the existing one and add David's suggestion in the future if this expands to the whole API or to cases where that's valuable.
Yeah, the only thing is that keeping the from and with separated, someone could be writing exactly what Steve has been describing. So you could have authenticate from, I don't know, personal access token header with deploy token and personal access token. And so someone could be using a deploy token on the personal access header for this endpoint, which is kind of wrong.
So I'm suggesting, or what I'm thinking is, if we needed that kind of, so if I remove the merging, then the two separate calls, the second call would override the first one. And if we needed that kind of behavior where, personal access token only from private token header, deploy only from deploy, so if an endpoint needed that behavior and was using the separate from and with, that it would need to switch to using the hash-based function. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So that was my thought. And that hash-based function is something we could add later when that becomes necessary.
The thing is that with the from with option, people can be still doing a mistake.
Well, I think like it would be, it would seem intentional if you're doing it that way with the from with, but couldn't you conceivably still do that with the hash? Have deploy token and then personal or private token.
You could achieve
header.
the same thing. It's gonna be a bit more verbose, which is, I guess, not necessarily a problem, but you won't get with the from with, you have an easy way to say from this here's all the ways you can get a token, here's all the kinds of tokens you can get, and allow any combination of those is simpler. Whereas with the hash method, you're going to have to redeclare one of those two arrays multiple times, which is not a big deal. Just maybe something to think about.
Yeah, I was wondering if we have such from options like private token header, perhaps we could add a validation so that you can't plug a deploy token in this header.
I would say that it's probably good to have some sort of a guard, but we shouldn't necessarily say only that, because, for example, well, I guess it's kind of tricky because I guess the deploy token header and the private token header are kind of like GitLab headers, whereas like OAuth is a standard.
Exactly.
So we accept various tokens through OAuth, but if we have private token, we don't, even in GitLab, we don't want to accept other things through that.
Exactly. We have both cases where we have the custom headers and we have the general way to send the token, which would be OAuth or basic auth or whatever. And we need to support both.
Yeah, I think it could be useful to have some sort of a validation, like, you know, like any headers that we define, we say we can only use certain tokens with. That's not a bad validation to have.
And actually, the private token header and the private token parameter will be used for the public API, because that's how you can access it, by the custom header or the custom parameter. So
My random crazy thought is the grape project is pretty active. This is totally a sidebar. And I know that people in GitLab have had some pull requests merged. I wonder if we could, how easy it would be to add something to set route settings by namespace. Just a random thought.
In route inheritable. Grape's naming convention is also a bit odd or cumbersome, unwieldy. That's the word, unwieldy. I think because there are namespace settings which are different from namespace inheritable, I think. So namespace settings behaves more like route settings in that you have to set it for each namespace, but namespace inheritable is nested. So that's, yeah, if you want some fun, when I was doing the metacoding, trying to figure out where things were defined was interesting, because Grape does some weird stuff. It's weird. It's not at all like it's defining on a class, adding it to collections that are then later turned into a dynamic class when I don't know, something happens. It's, yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit weird. Sometimes I miss the standard before action callback from Rails, which could save us here, but well, we don't have it.
Oh, one question. In your example redefinition of find user from sources, you say try namespace inheritable authenticate. Is that a default function?
Try is from it's from Rails. It's defined on the object directly. It's
Okay.
It's when you want to call a method, but you don't know if it exists or not. So try will return nil if the function doesn't exist or is not defined. You have an alternative, which is the ampersand dot, but this one has a curve hit, and I don't recall it right now.
I think the ampersand dot saves you if the receiver is nil, but not if the method is undefined.
Yeah,
So
yeah, something like that. And the try has the support of this situation. So the try, you can use it on nil, you can use it on an object that doesn't have the method definition, and it will just work. Okay, so that's a good question. What do we do with the syntax? Well, out of the code here, I'm not super fan of supporting two ways to declare the authentication settings. I would rather have only one, just to be simple and boring, and that's it. And yeah, I can see the issue raised by Steve with the form width on the public API, perhaps not on the package managers, because it's almost always either OAuth or a basic auth, or it's not a custom header. Well, it is for Maven, but it's not a header that is dedicated for personal access. What I'm talking about, it is for Maven.
Yeah, Maven is the only one.
Yeah, we do have to send private token header or job token. And one is for the personal access token and the other one is for the job token.
So for the Go endpoint, based on anticipating, well, Go does not have a good way of authenticating requests at the moment, but there is a proposal that one of the original developers and maintainers made. So anticipating that that will eventually make it in, for Go, it would be nice to have basically the same methods for the most part as the main API. So the personal access token with the personal or private token header and things like that. So that is an example where that might be desired.
Yeah, and we already have the case with Maven. So with Maven, we have to support the personal access token and the job token, and they are both in two different custom headers. And yeah, that's exactly the situation with the from with parameter. How do you handle this situation?
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm good with that. Are you, David, are you comfortable with calling that function? So personally, I find it more straightforward to say authenticate, or the second example in your last comment. So the token colon basic auth header source thing. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
Yeah, you mean using the token type as a key?
Yes, that's
Instead of using the source as a key, if we want.
Yeah. So that one is my preference.
Yeah, it might be better to have first the job tokens types, so as the keys, so that when you read the code, that's the first thing you will reach is the token type, and then it's the source. So might be slightly better this second version.
And on that note, I was thinking so you have authenticate with token and then like job token colon. I was thinking authenticate with
Yeah.
might be good enough. Okay.
Yeah. The function name was something I made up in 30 seconds, so it was not a good one, I guess.
All right.
Authenticate with could be better, yeah.
One other thing. So on your original comment, or on the comment with your long comment a
Yeah.
week ago, you talk about whether or not two classes are necessary. So I originally had one class. I had the authentication strategy class, and that
Yeah.
and we talked about that. And one of the big things is that the authenticate function, the context in which that is called, or it's called once per endpoint definition. So the instances created per authenticate call cannot be used for memoization of requests without some, or at least not simply, because they are created per endpoint, not per request. So I could have something in there that would duplicate that allowed strategies object for each request. Probably, I think I could probably do that, but the memoization can't go on the one that's created during the authenticate method for that reason. So that's, I think, Well, maybe not exactly why I have two classes, but that does make things a bit.
Yeah, well, this is a minor point. I was thinking into having everything together, but at one point, I think we might want to have different classes for example, different classes for the different sources, or different classes for the different job token types. So that imagine that you have a class for the deploy token header source, and this class could encapsulate the validation that you will just accept the deploy token type. But that's a really long way. So we have to first start something simple. It's a minor thought if things could be more readable, everything packed together, but I guess I'm okay with two classes too.
Okay. There was something else.
Yeah, I think there was a second minor point.
The access token function. So I don't know if that is completely necessary because access token is called various, well, at least once or twice in all of, well, I have found places where it is called. I don't really know exactly what it's for. So that was one where I saw it and I said, this looks like it's being used by things deep inside the internals of the authentication web, but I don't exactly know when or where it's called. So I just decided it would be safer to override it. But
yeah, I tried to play around because I had to check the previous point. If we could have everything together, what would it look like? And I didn't override the access token, and it was working. So perhaps what you could try is try to run the NuGet packages spec, and you can try with overriding the access token, but also overriding it and returning nil, or yeah, just have an empty override so that if it is used, it will just blow up and see if the test passes. And this way you will know if the API use it. From what I recall, we don't use it in the NuGet API because we don't have to have access to the token. We are not interested into that. We are just getting the user, and that's enough for us. Perhaps it's used in Conan, where we need to get the access token from the very first request, which is made with basic auth, and you need to read the personal access token to then encode it as a GWT token. So perhaps well, my guess would be that it's used there, but since we are just adding the support for the NuGet API, if it's not needed, I would just remove the override, and we will revisit how to provide this function when we add the support of this refactoring in the Conan API. One thing I noticed with the tests is that the NuGet API has to reply sometimes to anonymous requests that it needs to authenticate. So basically the NuGet CLI tool, when you enter the URL of the GitLab package registry and you try to pull a package, the very first request, it will not use any authentication at all. And the backend has to reply the standard
Okay.
The standard thing for basic auth. I don't remember the status code, but well, basically say, okay, you are trying to access this, but you need to authenticate first. And then the CLI will use the credentials that you added and send a request with basic auth. So I did notice that I run into some issues on this case because we have tests for that. I think it's an anonymous request on a private project, and we should be replying, please authenticate response code. So there might be something to do right there.
Yeah, I saw those errors, and those have been fun. There was when I at some point when I was changing when I had changed around where some of the methods were defined, and I had copied them or moved them into a different class. Undoing that seemed to fix some of the failures, but yeah, so I'm aware of that. I
Okay.
have not completely figured out.
But we can do it in small steps. First, perhaps it's implementing all we discussed, and I will post a summary of it on the MR. And then once this is working, we can take a look at these failures, because I'm quite sure that they will fail, or perhaps not. We'll see. But I remember a strange case where, yeah, it was something like you have an anonymous request on a private project, and you can just reply bad request or unauthorized. Otherwise, you will just blow up the NuGet CLI workflow. So you need to reply a specific response code.
So I think this is one of the things that I was a bit confused by. In the NuGet spec, on the first block of, test a whole bunch of different ways of, public and private project with different levels. There's one line on line 70 where, as far as I can tell, it says the user role is anonymous, but user token is true. I don't know how you get anonymous for a public project when you are still passing a user token.
Well, the anonymous will just set the role. We have a few objects at the top of the file. You can see there is the user and there is a project. And this column of the user role will create an association between those two objects. And when it's anonymous, the association will not be made. There will be no link between the two objects. If you have developer, a developer association will be created so that the user is a member of the project as a developer. But when it's anonymous, you will not have any association. And this test just verifies that if someone tries to send his user token, well, personal access token, but he is accessing a public project, he still have access to it because it's a public project.
Right, that makes sense. Okay.
You can see that on the last scenario on line 79, it's the same one, exactly the same. The only thing is that the project visibility is private. So the expected result would be unauthorized, because even though the user sent his personal access token, he is not a member of the project because he doesn't have any association with the project. So he will be rejected.
I think in terms of the code, that's pretty much saying that if you look into the whole declarative policy section where we define all these permissions, it's just saying, like, if we receive a nil user, but with a token that has this access, what do we do?
Yeah, that makes sense now. when I saw anonymous, I was assuming that meant without credentials.
No,
So that's,
it's the user role from the project perspective, if you want.
yeah. Yeah, that makes sense now.
And I recall adding these scenarios because I think we had an issue where if you send your personal access token and you try to access a public project, your access would be rejected, which is like confusing and not expected. Since it's
Yeah.
a public project, you shouldn't be looking at the permissions at all. So that's why I added those cases.
Mm-hmm. Oh, um, you asked about overriding toString or 2s. I'm
Yep.
using, so I, with the way I'm currently memoizing, I need either the ID or source attribute, or so you made a comment that don't add the attribute reader unless you're using it. So I removed the attribute reader. Turns out I was using it for memoization. So
Okay.
instead of adding it back, I added toString.
No, in that case, it would be better to add back the reader.
Right.
Sorry
Okay.
about that.
No
No,
problem.
the general rule here is that when you have a instance variable, those at blah, blah, blah variables, if you don't need them outside your class, you can just use the add variable and that's it,
Yeah.
so that the state is properly encapsulated in the instance. If you need the outside world to access them, yeah, you can use a public attribute reader and that will work.
Yeah. Yeah, I did toString just because it makes the memoization slightly more concise.
But in general, in Ruby, I don't see that much the override of the toAs function, because by default, it will just dump all the instance with all the fields. So sometimes you will have, what we can call a pyramid of doom. So a lot of attributes and fields, and those fields are objects. So it will dump also their attributes, and you have nested structures. But at least you have everything, and it's less confusing than just having a fixed string. Having said that, I do know that in the GitLab code base, there are a few places where the 2S has been overridden. I think for the project model, it has been done. But unless we have a really, really clear argument to override this method, we should be just use the default implementation.
All right. Well, I don't have, there's nothing else that I marked to talk about.
Okay. I will summarize all the points on the MR, and well, you can ping me back when you made some progress on them. And yeah, the last weeks have been a bit busy, so I might be a bit delayed to answer, but I'm still following DMR. Don't worry about it. Okay, so I guess that should do it. I
Cool.
will stop the recording unless there is more questions. Okay.
All right. See you in 15 minutes.